And welcome back to episode 157 of the Turn Up For What podcast, talking your Houston Texans straight from the Great British Isles. We've not been very active, but there seems a hell of a lot happened. A pick squandered, a head coach fired, a GM search up and running, a couple of games won, and a miserable Sunday at home in front of nobody in Jacksonville. But it's all happened. But joining me this week is a returning guest, Mr. Mike Meltser. Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Yeah, we've been just explaining. There's kind of changes in your life. You've kind of less talking about this team, but I think after repeating myself sort of 15, 16 times, I thought, well, Christmas and New Year we took it off.
Well,
So
maybe things are on the upswing. I mean, I do like the list of candidates that they have at least asked for interviews. So there is that.
well,
There
that
is
yeah,
that.
yeah, and I think we were going to do this Monday, and I had to push it back. So apologies again to you, Mike. But I think actually it's probably done as good because we can kind of get a head start on all the guys and the names that have come out. But we'll give a brief interlude before we start getting those guys, because I think that's the meat of where we
Mhm.
are right now in this news cycle. But have you kind of, how have you processed? Have you kind of got over the fact that they managed to blow the first overall pick in the draft? They couldn't even be bad all the way right throughout the season.
I can't really get over the way it happened. Like it's one thing if they had just won the game in the way the first, I don't know, 40 minutes of the game went, right? Because got up to a 10-0 lead, and then Sam Ellinger threw two interceptions. Both were pretty ridiculous plays, especially that one to Kirksey. It's like, the hell are you doing? I mean, even the one that was taken back by Grenard was also a dumb play. But like, it seemed like okay, you got up to a nice start, and it just seemed like the Texans were slightly better, and it was compounded by the fact that Sam Ellinger does not look like he is an NFL quarterback. Does not look like he belongs on the field. But then it's like, oh, pick six, another interception by Davis Mills that's kind of heaved in the air. And then Indianapolis goes right down the field. Then the Texans go 3-and-outs, and then you punt it away, and then Indianapolis goes down the field and kicks a field goal. So you're like, okay, you're safe. It's not even like, hey, you're going to get the ball back down by 4 and you can score. Like it seemed like it was perfectly set up the last, I don't know, 10 to 15 minutes to where you're like, okay, competitive for a long time, and then you lose and it's like nice and easy. And then somehow, like, they start the drive at their own 17-yard line. They convert 3rd and 2, and then obviously, like, all of a sudden you're converting like 4th and 12, where nobody's covering Brandon Cooks of all people. And then the 4th and 20, where you're like, it was one of those few moments I had watching a game when I'm like, did I just actually see that
Yeah,
happen? Because
yeah.
you would think that there'd be like more people around that football to try to knock it down. Instead, it's one guy who totally mistimes his jump. And then I feel like even the announcers were kind of shocked that like the ball just ends up in Jordan Akins' hands. And then I think about like the 2-point conversion and how many times the Texans have gone for it where you actually needed it in a game that mattered, like I don't
Mm.
know, 2019 against Tennessee, or actually not 20, even 2020 against Tennessee when Romeo went for it,
Yeah, yeah.
and they couldn't get it, and like that's the time they get a 2-point conversion. But even still, like you had like a slight, what was there? Indianapolis gets it back with basically at 50 seconds or so. Like
Mm.
that's still an opportunity to go down the field. Like if that was Mahomes at quarterback, they would have found a way to get down the field, get a field goal attempt. Like you're only up by one in that spot. It's like everything that I still can't fully comprehend how that game was won.
Yeah,
Is my
yeah,
long way of telling you that.
yeah. It was almost like an air of shock, and I'll be honest. I mean, and it's not the greatest omission for somebody who's dedicated countless hours and much of it for pointless or limited return. But I think the last couple of games I didn't even watch, to be honest. And then I did watch that one, and it was reasonably enjoyable. And I thought it was the irony of the two lowest scoring offenses in the entire league managed to, put up 30 plus points. But a strange game from Quintoriano sort of taking it up 30 plus yards up the seam on a drive before
Yeah,
Aiken scored.
he's actually looked pretty decent.
Yeah,
Yeah,
he is actually. That's been one of the positives, I think. And he's kind of come out of nowhere with, because when you drafted him, people couldn't pronounce his name, far less tell you anything about him. So, yeah,
sure.
that is a sort of silver lining, I think, in amongst that. But with their own player punching the ball out, on the first
Yeah,
kickoff
but
return
like
after we scored.
they they had overcome all of that. They had overcome all those weird things to throw the intercept, throw the pick six, throw another one, and then like, you're comfortably down by 7. And oh, by the way, it's a place where almost anytime the Texans needed to win at Indianapolis, except for like 1 or 2 times, they could never win.
Hmm.
They could never
Yeah.
win except for Sunday.
Yeah. Yeah, Jalen Strong broke that record that for a long time with Brandon Whedon thrown to him. So even that game was quite odd. And then I suppose there
Yeah.
was the game in overtime where Frank Wright went for it fourth. I was there that day. That was very odd as well. You know, he came at the stadium pretty exhausted. So I think it was, yeah, I mean, it was an abomination of handling the situation. I think it was a two fingers up from Lovey. But I keep going back to the point and rolling over my head that if you thought that was even a possibility that the players would play hard from, and they have done at times, and then other times they've looked completely outmatched. Not necessarily against better opponents, just lack of game plan, lack of structure, lack of offensive cohesion. If you thought that was at risk at all, you should have fired him after the Jacksonville game. Empty stadium, didn't win a home game all season. If you thought it was a risk of removing your control or your route to the most premium asset you could possibly have in the
Yeah.
sport, a sport where there's a paradox because you've got players and coaches who push for competitiveness and excellence at an elite level, but yet you also have, which is effectively under the banner of parity, but it's cost control for the owners, but parity comes through the draft and it comes through the salary cap. So you kind of have a kind of strange conflicting philosophies of the fans wanting to be first overall, and rightly
Yep.
so. But then obviously the players want to go and win. Now that was always going to be at risk, but I think that the big takeaway for me is less so about who you could have picked, but the fact you couldn't control, your own shit at the time, and you couldn't make
Yeah.
you couldn't remove the risk, you couldn't take the right decisions to minimise any negative impact. And I think that's just a consistent theme with the Caserio era now for me, and I think I question him ever more than I ever have done right now.
Well, as people always talk about, like organizations are the ones that tank and not teams on the field or the court or the baseball diamond or whatever. It's all about who you put out there, right?
Yeah.
And the question would be like, the Texans seemingly had their healthiest injury report right before week 18. Like, of all things, when all
Yeah.
teams are as beat up as possible. And Brandon Cooks is out there after the year that he has had.
And his
And
comments.
yeah, and the nonsense that he's pulled off. And it's like I don't know what you do. I guess the only thing you could say is like, okay, let's put Cooks in mothballs. Like that in and of itself really helps your chances to lose the game. Just because if you're going to move the ball offensively, he'd be a key part of it. And without him, like it's really down to some weak receivers. It's hard. It's like again, if they had won the game the way it happened the first 40 minutes, the way the game played out, I would say, okay, this is kind of like they could like there was just no way they could lose to Indianapolis. Like that's how poorly Indianapolis was playing. But the crazy way that it turned out, I think, is something that's hard for people to swallow. And I'm a little bit disappointed that in the press conference Monday and the interview Nick Caserio did on Wednesday on 610, like nobody really addressed the fans' disappointment about falling from 1 to 2. And I realize it's an awkward question, but I think it has to be asked something
Mm.
to the effect of like, hey, listen, Cal, Nick, whoever, a lot of we understand you're trying to win. There's a large part of your fan base that is very disappointed that you fell to the number 2 pick. What would you say to those people?
Yeah, I think as well it's an odd one because I think, and we'll come on to the coaches and stuff as well, but I think it's an asset to leverage to agents when you're trying to pitch why their client would be well placed for you. And I think the irony is you could have the Colts jump the Texans,
Yes.
um, and the Bears benefit a benefit you could have had off and to make it worse, a team that you lost to. In rather convincing style. I know it was a late pick, but I think they were the far better team that day earlier in the season. So I think there's a lot of factors in there, but for me, it's the fact that you could have controlled it, you didn't control it,
Yep.
and not only that, your franchise is worse off. So if you think you could and this is not about Bryce Young, I think you have to see it broader than that. It's more about
Of course.
and he might be the best quarterback in this draft. I think there's probably a consensus that he is. he might be the best quarterback in the next 3 years. People tend to always think the next year's class is better. There's no guarantee about that. There's no guarantee any of these guys will, the names that are coming in 24 will continue form, injury, etc. So you kind of got to pick what you can now, but I think not taking a quarterback this year when you're in the top 1 or 2 is a risk for a team that desperately needs one. But regardless if you were sold or not, you lost the ability to trade back, just like you lost the ability of a second round pick to fortify some more roster and try and fill some holes by not trading Brandon Cooks. You had him out there despite him making comments about the team making big plays, catching touchdowns, and winning you games when you didn't need to win the games. There was no benefit to anybody to win those, considering how bad this team has been. So, yeah, I think Caserio was interesting. I suppose going for 2 as well, and I think I heard you say this earlier in the week, Mike, that you've never normally gone for that if that was a competitive game. If you had to get into the playoffs, for example.
Yeah, so I mean that's what I wonder about as well. I mean, listen, you can go either way. A lot of teams will go for 2 when they score like that and there's like little time left. You can go either way. Like the Tennessee example is a good one. I think probably the equivalent situation a couple of years ago, and they went for 2. Deshaun's pass was knocked down. They lose the game. I could kind of see it going either way because you worry. But like I just wonder, like, if this was like you just felt the whole time during the drive that if these guys find some way to get into the end zone, they're going to try to like stick the knife in and go for 2. Whereas if this was week 3, would Lovey have gone for 2? If this was
he didn't 5, do week 1. He kicked a field goal, or he punted rather than kicking a field goal in week 1. So, yeah, and that tie eventually was the difference. Ironically, again.
And again, it boils down to really the quarterback. Like, there's obviously a world in which what happened on Sunday doesn't hurt the franchise, but it all depends on all these unknowable things right now. Like the Texans are probably going to draft a quarterback at number 2. That's most likely. But a quarterback, and I've heard other people talk about it this week, it's not like you rank quarterbacks like you rank running backs or defensive ends or corners. Like typically a quarterback is like hiring like the CEO of a company. It's not like, oh yeah, we've ranked like 3 people. It's like this is like a huge deal. Like we draft this guy, and 50 people at NRG Stadium, their jobs depend on whether this guy's good or not. And so is it likely that Nick Caserio ranks Bryce Young and CJ Stroud similarly, or Levis or Anthony Richardson? It all kind of makes sense in my head. It's hard to sort of like articulate kind of these possibilities, but I'm wondering, like, what set of circumstances do we need for what happened on Sunday to not be a big deal? Because you don't know how this thing plays out. Like, it's going to look bad if Indianapolis trades up and drafts Bryce Young, and people will like lose their minds. But then there's a possibility that like Bryce may not be good, and then who you pick at number 2 is going to be good. But you still, ultimately, it comes back to the control. You'd rather have the ability to control everything. And now we're going to be sitting here for the next 3.5 months, basically at the mercy of the Chicago Bears, and essentially hoping that the Texans draft board has some substantial differences from the teams that might want to trade up to number 1, and specifically Indianapolis. Like that, That's all I can really think of right now.
Yeah, and I suppose if the Bears just don't get the price they're looking for, and then they just sit and pick, if they think, well, Anderson's going to be an all-pro level rusher, then you take him, and then you sit there and you got the pick of the 2. That's the ideal scenario. But I mean, think,
yes. But I think you're right. I think that's the ideal scenario. Yeah, I think the ideal scenario for the Texans is probably, okay, nobody really loves the quarterbacks enough to move up a lot for them. Eberflus, the Bears coach, falls in love with one of the 2 defensive players, and they just grab one. So where you would say, okay, well, if you're the Texans, now you still control almost as much as you could have. That would be the best case scenario, if the Bears just stay and pick a defensive player. But even if like the Bears in some world stayed and picked a quarterback, like even that might be even more of a disaster because ostensibly they'd be trading Justin Fields in that hypothetical, but they probably wouldn't be doing it to you. So it's of like no benefit at all.
Yeah.
But yes, best case scenario is Bears stay at 1, draft a defensive player.
And I think that's, it's not an ideal scenario, I think, regardless. But I think if you're sitting there at 2, then you just trade, if you do you trade out and hope somebody wants to overpay for Jalen Carter, like a great player, explosive athlete, but is a defensive tackle going to solve all your woes, or do you use that, turn that asset into a couple of players? It spreads the risk of your picks. By definition, they are lottery. So yeah, I think we really done ourselves out with that. I think we lost leverage with coaches, and we obviously lost potential control of the draft and being at the top of every round and what have you. So we'll be 2-11, I think, from the Browns pick. So there's plenty of equity there this year.
Yes.
But you touched on Caserio's presser. He'll be the man potentially making these calls. There was obviously the Jay Glazer report prior to Sunday about potentially both jobs being up in the air. Just Sheena Anderson tweeted out as well subsequently in the days after about unrest, I think, was the overall theme. I think his press conference, Nick, was really timid and very kind of open in a sense that he realizes that he's not got much more room for error. And I'm glad we finally got to this bit, because I've been saying this for probably 18 months. I think he's limited in terms of being perhaps an elite, and I think people are good at different jobs, and different jobs take different skill sets. And I've kind of always been of the opinion, Mike, that I think he's an excellent player evaluator, and so therefore, you'd be a great head of pro personnel, or
Sure.
college scouting, or personnel in total. But I don't think he's a GM, and I've always thought that. I know he's good at negotiating. I know he's good at the salary cap. I think he does too much. I don't think he delegates, and he sort of admitted a bit of that in the press conference. So where do you think this leaves Nick? And what did you make of it? I know his tone of the second interview on 610 that you referenced also was slightly different the next day. It looked like he'd had a bit of sleep, I
Yeah.
think. But I don't know if
I
his
do
cage
think
was rattled. But what did you make of the whole press and some of the comments he made?
I thought it was a bizarre news conference.
It was,
One of the
yeah.
weirdest I've seen. Yeah. And I think part of it, I think Landry Locker pointed this out on his show, that you probably have to also zoom out and think about the headspace that Nick was in. They had just won the game. They flew back. The next 24 hours are probably not getting a whole lot of sleep because, you're firing the coach that night. So presumably you get back to, I presume you don't do that on the plane. I presume you get back and bring him into an office and do it then. So you got to deal with all of that, releasing statements. And then Monday, prior to the news conference, I imagine Nick gets in early and he's doing exit interviews with everybody he can, players, coaches. And so it's not like he woke up at 10 o'clock, went down to get breakfast, and then he was kind of chilling until the news conference. He had a lot going on. And I did think he sounded, I agree, timid at the news conference, well, gosh, if somebody doesn't think I'm right for the job, I guess I'll kind of fall on the sword kind of thing, which you never hear from a GM.
Yeah,
and I thought the tone was different the next day,
yeah.
for sure.
And it was the reference to somebody, which I don't know if that's a reference to Hannah, because she's obviously pulling the strings. I think that's quite clear. But yeah, it was it wasn't Cal doesn't think that, the McNairs don't think that, it was somebody, and I thought that was quite an interesting choice of phrase as well.
Yeah. My sense is that I think Caserio is going to be here. Unless they hire Sean Payton, which I think is just statistically unlikely, then I think when you look at the other candidates, Jonathan Gannon, Ben Johnson, Evero, Mike Kafka, I'm missing a bunch of names, but they're younger guys. They're in between the ages of 38 and 45. And I think they're going to come in and work with Nick. But my distinct feeling is that I don't think Caserio is going to have that same level of power. And I think that's partially based on what ownership thinks, and also part of maybe Nick realizing that, okay, we tried to hire Jonathan Gannon last year, and reportedly, Nick wanted to control a lot of that coaching staff. Now, after Cully and Lovey and those failures, maybe he himself realizes, hey, I got to, take my hand a little bit off sort of the accelerator on that and let these coaches come in and bring in their own staff, to where there is more of a 50-50 share between, more of a balance of power, I would say, between the head coach and the GM. So I say that all to say, I think what's most likely to happen is they hire a younger coach and Nick's power is reduced, but in a good way. In a good way, in that the coach has more of a say in the coaching staff, maybe drafting players, the final 53, the game day roster, and there's more of an overall power share in the organization. Because they also at some point, they need a face of the franchise. And the last 2 years, the face of the franchise has been the general manager.
Yeah, which is not healthy.
And yeah, and like, how many other NFL teams can you say the general manager is the face of the team? Like, you could probably say it about New England because Belichick is also the GM. You could have maybe said it about like Indianapolis, and maybe like one other place, but in general, it's either the head coach or a player.
Yeah. I think when he reflects, and I know obviously that it is sort of kind of the trodden line that the last two coaches were forced upon him, and that might well be the case. But I think for me, is it a case of he hired them out of set of circumstances? Because I think what's really different now, Mike, I think, is the fact that if you look at this list, and I don't know if he reflects upon the previous coach he hired, two older, and a lot was made about African American
Yep.
and all that kind of stuff, and all the kind of connotations and the one and done stuff that goes around. But ultimately, the last two coaches were not good enough. One was outdated, one should never have been there. Now, but when you look at this coaching
Sure.
hire, particularly from Sean Payton, who's kind of in a subset of his own, and as you said, I don't think that one's likely, but you never know. It feels like that maybe be ownership driven because it's an easy kind of name to point to. But I think when you look at the speed of this process right now and how the names came out quickly, and the caliber of
Yeah.
candidates that are across the 7 or 8 names that they've got. There's only 5 openings right now, unless somebody gets knocked out unexpectedly. The wild card potentially happens. But I think when you look at that, the whole thing feels entirely different now. I don't think that's just down to an Easterby factor. I think there's a lot of factors at play. But what do you kind of reflect on on how these names have come out, the quality of them, and how the process seems promising at this stage? Obviously, a hell of a long way to go. But what do you think of just the kind of general caliber and the process so far?
It looks like they're running a better coaching search with the obvious caveat that the coaching search ultimately comes down to which one of these do you kind of reel in. But unlike the last couple of years where they're interviewing all sorts of randoms, I mean, that is operating its business properly. Like, here are the people we want to interview. We want to interview Jonathan Gannon, Ajiro Evero, Ben Johnson, Mike Kafka, D'Amico Ryans, Shane Steichen. These are the kind of names you want to be requesting interviews with. Sean Payton, I think that was a surprise to a lot of people, that they even requested to speak with Sean Payton. I don't think the Texans would have even done that in
No.
the last two coaching searches. It looks like an organization that's like, hey, we have to start to win at some point, and we need to run a serious search. And so we're gonna shop in the most expensive area of the grocery store because that is what we need.
Yeah. And I always find that an interesting dynamic because the way in which these interviews are timed while there's still games being played is
Sure.
quite fascinating. You think
It's weird.
really, yeah, it should really. I mean, in my opinion, it should just start at the end of the season once all games are finished. Then you've got the chance to hire the coach, or
Yeah.
or it's unimpeded, or there's a window prior to the playoffs or what have you. So you fire your coach early, and then once the playoffs, it's a closed book until after. But when you think of Ben Johnson, who interviewed today, Evero, who's meant to be interviewing tomorrow, so Shane Steichen, but Thomas Brown,
Mm-hmm.
the Rams assistant coach, former running back, big personality. Evero seems like a leader. Ben Johnson, offensive guru. Those 3 guys potentially have a leg up because their teams aren't in the playoffs, and that happens every year. So if you're going to wait till second week of February to
Yeah.
build the coaching staff, miss out on the staff, delay in time, and time is just not something this league gives you, despite not playing games till August September. I
Yeah.
find that fascinating, but
It's a great point.
yeah, and I think
Yeah,
those three
it's
guys
hard to mesh because
potentially
you
have a
like,
chance to differentiate themselves.
yeah, I think because you have a couple of things that are sort of running against each other. You want to run a comprehensive search, right? Like, you want to interview people, you want to get solicit opinions on your organization, even if you don't hire people. Like, you want to go through the process and fully vet these guys. At the same time, you also want to move assertively and aggressively, and that can mean like, okay, um, once I complete a second interview with somebody, do I kind of sit around and wait? Or if I really like the guy, do I say, okay, because to me, the big one is when we go from the first, here's kind of the steps for me. Okay, interview request sent out. Then they start doing the interviews. And then it's like that next part once the first interviews are complete, like who else do they interview? And then who starts getting the second interviews? Because once you start getting the second interviews, you're like, okay, if they're talking to somebody the second time, like they have to be serious about hiring that person as the head coach. And once you complete that second one, I think that's when it's hard as an organization because then you're like, okay, we've probably gone through everything. Yeah, we probably know if we would hire this person as head coach, do we just try to pull this guy in, or continue the comprehensive search and worry about losing him? What I think that's the harder part. Like right now is probably the easier part. Although I am feeling more optimistic based on what they've done so far this week.
Yeah, and we've only seen three out of the so many names confirmed, and I think that's the key. But I think for me, I just think they can't be last again because they've been last the last 2 years in a
Yes,
row to fill the vacancy. I think they have been. Yeah, that's right. They have been two years in a row,
they have been last. Yeah,
and you can't do that again. And that's probably going to be the biggest learning. You find the candidate and you be decisive, like you said. And I think, for me, Evero, when you watch him talk, seems like a head coach. Thomas Brown,
yeah.
less experience, whereas Evero's the oldest guy, bar Sean Payton in this, and I'm not quite sure about Kafka. He's going to come in as well, but again in the playoffs, likely to go out. So Kafka's probably going to come in at some point. But you expect the Eagles and the 49ers to be there, and I think it's a difficult one. Do you have a preference in candidate? And it's really difficult because I think you have to differentiate between who's a hot coordinator like Ben Johnson, or is he actually a leader of men? And I think there's a big difference, and a big difference in skill sets of what makes a great coordinator or a position coach that makes a head coach. Very different skill sets.
For me, off the top of my head, I would say D'Amico Ryans for me, number one.
Yeah.
Two, Shane Steichen, and then three, Mike Kafka. But I say that I'd be fine with Evero. I'd be fine. I'd be fine with any of these guys. I don't know as much about Thomas Brown because he's kind of new to the assistant head coach role. I don't think he's been a coordinator. But the other names on the list, I'd be fine with every single one of them. But if I had to rank them, like D'Amico, because I do think, even though you don't want to necessarily make decisions on this basis, like if they hired D'Amico Ryans, you would have a similar reaction to when Michigan hired Jim Harbaugh at the end of 2014. Like it would be after basically like years wandering around the forest. Like if they hired D'Amico Ryans, they would throw a parade at the press conference. Like that's what that would be.
Yeah.
If D'Amico was interested and they hired him, like they would pick the biggest room at NRG Stadium and have a whole deal when they introduce him. Like that's how they would do it. And I do think there's real value because of the lack of buzz the last couple of years. But it's hard, right? Like you heard great things about Mike Kafka, only been an OC for a year. Ben Johnson feels like the flavor of the month, but like some of those guys are legit geniuses. Like some of those guys are the next Sean McVay. And we just don't know, like, is Ben Johnson a leader of men? I have no idea. Jonathan Gannon, I know there's some criticism about like how good actually is the Eagles defense. That doesn't bother me as much as because like with the Vrabel thing, wasn't a great DC in Houston. I think he's been a really good head coach. So that part for me with Gannon does not bother me as much.
Yeah. I struggle to see how you can hire Gannon because if it was just the staff selection and that was the big factor, which I don't believe that. I think there has to be more than just that there. Then how can he come back to the table? One, if the unless it was a sort of, I said this before, unless it was a kind of, let's revisit this next year. We're both interested, but we agree it's not the right time. And it was kind of the long play. But I think when you go back to something, you could have had him last year, you could have him this year, you could have had he could have built some of the foundations that he may not have with the luxury of time, particularly when your general manager's under ever growing scrutiny. Particularly,
here's what I would do. I would throw it in the category of life is weird. Life is not black or white. Life is complicated, three-dimensional, all of it. And I think it could be kind of relating back to what we were mentioning 10, 15 minutes ago that, maybe Nick Caserio, because that's the rumor, or that's kind of the report, that they were going to hire Gannon, but they weren't willing to let him hire his staff. There were reports, I think specifically, that they wanted him to hire Josh McCown on his staff, which obviously he'd have huge reservations about. Yeah. It could be as simple as like Nick's gone through the year. They won 3 games and tied another, and they need to win, and he loved Gannon, and he realizes like, hey, I need to compromise. Yeah. Humans can do that. They can say like, hey, like I was wrong. We need to hire this guy and I need to compromise some of these things to bring this guy in.
Yeah, and I think with
So
D'Amico, I think it's the ultimate unifier, isn't it? It's almost a
yes,
way to, and if he is successful, because I think he is the perfect blend of natural leader, dominant character, alpha type character, former player, X's and O's, pretty, up there with the
yep.
elite. Obviously, he's got some great talent there, but I think being a sort of decorated player, in this history with the club, I think it would just tick so many boxes, and you would buy yourself time and you'd buy yourself equity with the fan base that you've not had, probably since 2020.
In a
So I
long
think
time.
for me, he's the ideal. But I think if you're him, and I think with a lot of these candidates, Mike, I think it's fair to ask the question: why would they want to come to Houston?
I think the answer is that you can build this basically like a house, that you're not buying a house that was built in 1862, that you are basically buying a plot of land that's got, some foundation that's starting to be built, and you can basically design everything. You want a great kitchen, you want, four bathrooms, you want whatever you want. Like you can build this. They've got the number two pick, not as good as number one, but they have the number two pick. They should be in line to get a quarterback, either in the draft or free agency, or maybe both if you wanted to do that. And you have a whole lot of equity moving forward here in terms of draft capital. They have cap space moving forward. And I also think that because they fired two coaches a year in the last two, the next coach, I believe, in contrast to what the national media thinks, I believe is almost guaranteed to have a lot of job security
Mm,
because this next coach has to be the guy. So I think that's why the job is much more appealing because you basically have an open avenue and you throw in the division, which I don't think is that good,
yeah.
obviously. So that to me is what makes the job more appealing, much more appealing than it's been the last 2 years.
Yeah, and I think if you think of the Cardinals, a roster that's in tatters and needs a renovation, you're committed to a quarterback who I think's proven what he is at this stage. Carolina, perhaps maybe one of the more safer bets, but you're going to be under pressure from an owner who wants his
Yeah,
success.
there's no easy avenue if you're Carolina to bring in a quarterback.
No,
Um, Indianapolis, you're working for a crazy person, a head coach.
yeah,
I actually think Denver's a better job than a lot of people think. But yeah, I think the appeal of the Texans' job is that when you come in, there's nothing that you have to acquire that you have no say in.
hmm yeah, and
That's how I look at it.
maybe that's the motivation of the shift in Caserio, and hopefully that is or can translate to success, and I think that's the key. Who lasts longer, Mike? This next head coach or Caserio?
That's a question I've been thinking about. You know what? I'm going to say the next head coach.
Yeah.
I think there's a chance that because they've lost so much credibility nationally with the constant coach firings, that they're going to be uh, they're going to be sort of ultra defensive of the next head coach, and maybe he gets more power, and Nick eventually leaves. If I had to put a bet on it, I don't know what the odds would be, but I would actually lean towards the next head coach. I would
Yeah, no,
because
I
I,
think
I
I,
expect
yeah.
the power dynamic to change.
I think 100%. I think if you were going to fire Nick, and you want to bring a new GM, you had to do it this off season, and that doesn't not necessarily saying much. But I thought it was an awkward exchange when Caserio came on the stage with Cal. He looked pissed off at the, when you saw him walking along the sidelines with his son, and I think it's a
Yeah, that
strange
was
place to
weird.
be. Yeah, and I think you've got his wife spitting feathers at the back of media conferences and things, and she's obviously got a growing influence. There's all these new phrases, all this like accountability, challenge everything, all this kind of stuff that's coming out. So I think and Cal's been involved in the process, which I don't know what he's going to add. Let's be
Yeah, I
honest.
don't know what that means.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you think he should be involved anyway. So I don't know where it's going, but it seems like a positive change so far. I think, Mike, the first stage for me is who actually accepts. So we've had three out of these names.
Agreed.
And then we'll see who we come in for second interviews. And so in terms of timelines, Mike, when do you expect this to be settled?
I would say it'll be settled in 2.5 weeks. So you've got the wild card round weekend, divisional round. I'll say the tricky thing, obviously, is I think if there was a Vegas favorite, I still think it'd be Gannon, and the Eagles might play for a while. But I'll say two, yeah, I'll say 2.5 weeks because I think that actually takes me through conference championship weekend. That to
Yeah.
me is the over/under 2.5 weeks.
And you think Gannon?
If I had to put money on it, I would put a few shekels on Gannon. But
Hmm.
I'm not. I think that he entered this coaching search as the favorite, but I think only a slight favorite. I think they are very open to these other candidates. That's my sense from the outside.
Yeah, it seems wide open to be honest. I don't even know who you'd put money on it. I think Gannon would be the obvious one, but then you're not going to get much return uh,
Yeah,
from your $20 if you put on. So I think it's just this. I hope that the non-playoff candidates perhaps have a chance to get a foot forward, assuming Payton's not in. Obviously, D'Amico's the favourite for me, but I think and it will be for most people. But that's not necessarily saying he's the best head coach. But I think I think Denver go offense, so therefore I think, but
I can see that.
but people often go for the opposite of what they've had. And I don't know if you can count Cully, but we've had two. We've had
Yeah,
an offensive coach in O'Brien, and then we've gone so as opposed to Lovey in many essences is defensive. So do we go back to offensive? I don't know. But it's to be decided, Mike. I think it's whatever we do. I think hopefully if they shop and get one of these guys, as you said, it would be good and it would be favourable. But I still, until the process is done from end to end, I've got no confidence that it could be derailed because we saw that with the head coaching search, we saw that with the GM search, and that and not all the and needs to be factor is removed, and that may have been the source of it. But I think there's more than just one man playing in that. So there's always forces at play. We only see the tip of the iceberg. This search could go anyway. It feels like it's in the right direction now, but until it's settled and until we're watching that opening presser, I'll probably feel uneasy about it.
I feel very similarly. I feel more optimistic. I like the names. Honestly, I like the assertiveness with which we didn't go to sleep on Sunday wondering, hey, is Lovey going to be able to convince Cal to keep him? No, he's gone that night. Then immediately Monday, you get a list of names that they have request interviews with. I think they're operating this coaching search in a much better, more organized, more efficient, aggressive way. But because the organization has lost any benefit of the doubt, you're not going to be able to have full confidence until they actually name a head coach. That's
Yeah,
where I'm at. I think they're doing a better job, but they have to finish the job. But they got to go through the process first and then finish it.
yeah. And that's it. And I think the fact that the pool of openings right now is smaller, I think, has played in our favour versus previous
Yes,
years. So you have that going for you.
I think it helps.
We're in need of luck. We're in need of a good hire. Where it quite ends up, we shall see. But Mike, thanks for your time. Appreciate shooting this around an unusual recording day of a Thursday. But
Sure.
we'll be back when the head coach gets hired probably, and then a couple of times this off season. Time commitments is probably going to be news driven rather than content driven this off season. But hopefully we'll be talking about a successful hiring process when we come back. But I feel myself drawing a breath as I say that. So let's see.
Sure.
And you can't trust them until they prove it, Mike. I think that's what we've learned, and I think we're not quite there yet. But I think the fact that we're positive about it being functional and normal is it tells you everything where we've been as fans, onlookers, and media types, and everything like that. I think it's been very, very unfunctional, but here we go. Here's to a new dawn of positivity and normality.
Yes, normality.
In terms of pro football. But thanks to Mike for his time. Thanks everybody for listening. Apologies we've not been back, but it's just the way life goes sometimes as things get a little bit busier out of this. But we'll be back. Hopefully talk about a new head coach. And thanks again for listening for the Turn Up for What podcast. We'll speak to you